In 2014, Ted Hanley joined Workplace Safety North as the General Manager of Ontario Mine Rescue. Before joining WSN, Ted was certified as an Ontario Mine Rescue emergency responder and served as an active volunteer in the Timmins District. Ted Hanley will be talking about the International Mines Rescue Competition, I was there, hosted by WSN in August 2016, which welcomed 27 teams from 13 nations for the first international competition in Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, Ted Hanley.
Can you hear me okay? Levels okay? Right on. Well, thanks for having me, and I'm here to talk to you about something that happened last year. WSN was proud to host the 2016 International Mine Rescue Competition, and the only problem is I don't know who picked an engineer to speak to you right after lunch about mine rescue, but if I see heads bobbing, I'm going to point you out. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with mine rescue, I think you're in the minority here, because looking at the registrants list for the conference, just to my knowledge, about half the people have been actively involved in the Ontario Mine Rescue Program or emergency services in their career, and probably a quarter of the people that I don't know have been involved as well. So a lot of this will be old news to you, but the event itself wasn't old news. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Workplace Safety North, and we were proud to host it. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to go into a little bit of the history. That'll put you to sleep, but then we'll talk about how we became the host of the competition. We'll talk about some of the logistics around it, and then get into some of the more interesting things about the events that took place. We'll talk about the equipment, some research that went on during the competition, and then some lessons learned for going forward. So, stupid question, but what is the International Mine Rescue Competition? The first two are pretty self-explanatory. It's an event where jurisdictions cross their borders to participate in a mine rescue event. Mine rescue is any kind of emergency service that typically takes place underground. It's the same as fire and EMS, but it's more challenging because of the underground environment. The competition part is where it doesn't fit the label. To strive to gain or win something by defeating or establishing superiority over others, that's not really what mine rescue competitions are about. And a lot of the faces in this room have participated in competitions before. I've got the Goldcorp Greatest Hits team here in the front row. They know all about it. So competitions aren't really about superiority over others. There's a long history behind them, but really they're not about the awards. Now, there's nothing wrong with a big honkin' trophy every now and then, but really the competition is intended to evaluate mine rescue. I see we've chosen sides here. No, mine rescue competitions are not about winning and losing. As we all know, they're about evaluating against the standard. They're ensuring that companies and responders can meet the standard so that they demonstrate safe and effective emergency response procedures. Now, where this all started, it was actually the U.S. Bureau of Mines that formed in the early 1900s. They began what they called mine rescue demonstrations in 1911. And, they were way ahead of their time in doing that. They had two goals, really. They wanted to evaluate the newly formed mine rescue responders against the standards they were upholding with the new equipment that they were using. But they also made them demonstrations. They made them public forums. And in that way, they could share knowledge between not only the responders, but also the communities that those responders served. And that's carried forward to this day. Whether it's Ontario or other jurisdictions, one of the cornerstones is sharing that information not only with the responders, but with the public at large as well. It gives us peace of mind to know that these people are trained to a high standard, and they're ready to respond in the event of an emergency. Now, competitions in Ontario didn't start until 1950, not for lack of trying, but the competitions have continued on to this day. The international competition itself has a much shorter history. So the international competition was born out of tragedy, and I've borrowed this slide from my colleague Alex Griska. In 1998 in Poland, members of two separate mine rescue teams experienced a tragedy during what they would categorize as a routine mine rescue operation. They had some equipment failures, they had some conditions that were adverse, and 6 mine rescuers lost their lives, and a number of others were critically injured. Now, for those of you that have ever worked with the Poles or know about their proud mining history, they are an extremely proud mining culture. The trade of mining is held in high regard in Poland, and mine rescue is the pinnacle of that trade. So they took this to heart, and they didn't bury their head in the sand. They looked introspectively and thought, we have to get better. What they did was reach out to the international community. And this is 1998. It's before all the phones in our pockets were able to do that for us. So things took time. They began the process of forming what became the International Mine Rescue Body, but that process would take a number of years to take place. What happened, some low-hanging fruit happened, and that's the United States reached out to them, the Mine Safety and Health Administration, and said, well, hey, we run a national competition every year. Why don't you come over here and you can participate in it and evaluate yourself against that standard? At least in that regard, you can take some learning back to Poland and share that with your central mine rescue station. At the time, Poland had no concept of mine rescue competitions. They weren't evaluating in that way, other than the training that they were conducting in the field. So in 1999, Poland and a number of other countries traveled to Louisville, Kentucky for what would become the first ever international mine rescue competition. Now, there had been competitions before where a Canadian team would head to the States or vice versa, but this was truly an international sharing of standards and learning. So they continued the tradition the next year. The U.S. invited them back, and it began to grow from there. Eventually, they decided that they would hold the event every 2 years as it did begin to grow. And the U.S. passed the torch to some other host nations. Now, looking at that list of host nations, you might wonder, well, why did it take so long for Canada to become the host? We're a proud mining nation. We have the capacity. Well, there's a bit of a backstory to that as well. What happened was, leading into the 2008 event, Alex Griska, my predecessor, was lining, at the time, Masha up to be the host of the competition. Nickel was just coming off a $24 high. It was sitting around 14 bucks. Things were good 2007 going into 2008. And then that happened. 2009 happened. And the industry had other priorities here in the province. And the board of directors at Masha decided it wasn't the right time. So luckily, the coal sector was steady, and the Australians picked up the torch at the last minute. And again, the next 2 events after that were held by predominantly coal jurisdictions. It would be a number of years before Canada was given the opportunity to host again, before the conditions were right. When the Australians did host it, they did a remarkable job on extremely short notice. They did some innovative things as well. Those competitions had followed the American format for years. The American format was arena mine rescue, it was a convention center, it was the half walls, it was make-believe. The Australians, for the first time, thought, let's go underground. That's where we train. Why don't we evaluate each other underground? So they had an underground component. They added virtual reality to their competition, and they continued the cultural sharing aspect as well. When the Ukraine hosted it, unfortunately, it went back to the arena style. They were more familiar with it. They were used to the American style. Again, in Poland, they went back to that convention center arena style. And what's worse is it was trending towards a lack of information sharing. So Ontario had 2 teams that traveled to the Polish competition. And while the logistics and the cultural exchange was fantastic, their big frustration was in the competition itself. It wasn't challenging, and they didn't learn anything. They didn't get to see other competitors. Everything was top secret in the interest of fairness. So when Alex met with some of his international colleagues and the Polish delegates, they decided that it was the right time for Canada to host. And we formed an organizing committee made up of both Workplace Safety North staff as well as industry, and sat down to think about how this would work and how we wanted to frame it. the scary part about it is that some of the previous hosts had resources far beyond what Ontario has at its disposal. When China hosted it, they were getting ready to host the Olympics. They built a convention center just for the mine rescue competition. They built a stadium just to have the opening ceremonies in it. You know, it's hundreds of times the resource pool that Ontario has. When Poland hosted it, the president of the country was involved in the ceremony. So we knew we were going to be challenged in that regard, but we also knew that we're very good at what we do. The annual provincial competition that we hold here does go back to 1950, and it's an extremely well-run event, sometimes very long, but for the most part, it's challenging. And we took some of the things we've been trying to work on and incorporated them into the goals of the international competition. So the element of fairness and transparency, that was critical. And what rolled out of that is the ability to incorporate judges, technical volunteers, and rules from other jurisdictions. So for the first time ever, we attempted not just to put a stamp on the Ontario handbook and say, here are the rules for the international competition. We looked abroad and gathered input from international participants for how that competition should be run. We wanted to challenge the competitors. These are some of the best mine rescue responders in the world. They train, some of them up to a year for this event. They wanted to be challenged. They didn't want to walk through an arena. We wanted to continue the hospitality tradition. And lastly, we did want to go big or go home. We knew we were limited to just over 30 teams if there was that much interest, just the sheer logistics of getting through them and challenging them to the degree that we wanted to. But we set that as a goal to be the biggest international mine rescue competition ever. Now, the Workplace Safety North Board did approve the concept of hosting the event here in Ontario to be hosted in Sudbury, but it was conditional upon getting industry support. And at the time, Alex was a little bit concerned that we might have round two of a downturn, but just the opposite happened. Right from the Ministry of Labour out into the mining sector, support flowed in from day one, and it continued for 2 years until the execution of the event. In all, about 42 companies provided either financial or in-kind contributions to the event. 13 Ontario mine operators were represented by personnel at the event itself, working at over 24 underground mines in the province. Now, what it looked like with us bringing in international help and folks from around the province, it looked a little bit like this. So this map shows in the colored areas the participants that joined this event, either as competitors, as technical assistants and judges, or as delegates. It's quite a broad reach, and to be honest, we would have colored in a little bit more of the map, but coal took a bit of a hit right at about the time of registration. What that looked like was, as Rick mentioned, 27 teams representing 13 nations, roughly 350 competitors and delegates. We had 117 technical judges and volunteers representing an additional 6 nations for a total of 19 countries that were represented here. That's far beyond the representation that any previous international competition had had. One special note I would like to mention is for the first time ever, the competition had an internationally comprised team. Goldcorp took the unique approach of creating the Goldcorp Americas team. They took members from different operations that had never trained together, and they formed a team which competed at the competition. While the thought was nice, the results were unbelievable. The team performed beyond everyone's expectations. In Canada, what it looked like, well, we had 4 provinces competing with teams, and we had an additional 3 provinces and a territory represented as judges. A pretty broad spectrum from across Canada, which was nice to see. In total, about 750 people collaborated to pull this event off, including about 107 big-hearted local Sudburyans who volunteered their time both before and during the competition itself. 81 organizations worldwide were represented from the mining sector, government, military, academic, and service and supply. Now, as for the competition itself, as I mentioned, we wanted to do something different but the same. We wanted to have some of the same challenges, some standardized processes that are used around the world, but put an Ontario spin on them, put a challenge on them. We started off with a bit of Canadiana. The opening ceremony was meant to be held on a warm, sunny August afternoon, and it was the coldest August 21st in 23 years. Just shy of snow. Even one of the Russian teams went home early saying it was too cold. But to be honest, what we did was we decided to have a little bit of a relaxed outdoor Canadian welcome. We were at Bell Park, had a bit of a barbecue outdoor feel. It was meant to be casual, it was meant to be informal, and we introduced them to a little bit of the culture that we were hoping to showcase in Canada, and we kept up some of the traditions of previous competitions. The teams were paraded in the Olympic style with their flags. The teams that have uniforms and are very proud of their heritage all wore their colors. And we learned something too, which is that whether they're from Ontario or Russia or anywhere around the world, if you close the bar during an opening ceremony for 20 minutes, they will all get mad equally. It was a spectacular event, weather aside. The teams were ready to go. They had been in Sudbury for a number of days. And what was happening the same day as the opening ceremonies and days previous was another element of the international competitions, and that's orientation to equipment. So one of the things that you have to do to maintain fairness is boil down the task to something basic, something such as a rope rescue, and then introduce the teams to equipment that is an equivalent, but maybe something they're not used to in their home jurisdiction. So we had a 2-day orientation where the teams were brought to a local high school, put through the ringer on all the 6 events that they would be participating in, and given a chance to play with the equipment, ask judges questions, just short of the answer to the problem. So really, it was a great event. It was a bit of organized chaos, seeing all the cultures collide in that gymnasium. Here you can see our friends from Crosh measuring some of the competitors for a study that I'll mention in a little bit, and you could sense the nerves in the room, to be honest. It was part excitement, part nerves. A lot of the Canadian teams had never participated in an international competition. They were terrified of one of the Russian teams had sent a Rocky-style training video to intimidate everyone in advance. There were rumors going around about the Russian judges and this and that. But after we got through the orientation, the first 2 events, unrelated to one another, but were the technician competition and the theory exam. So the way the actual competition worked was there were 5 events that the team participated in that contributed to an overall score, and an individual event, that being the technician competition. So each team was allowed to send 1 specialist to participate in the technician competition. And we learned that a lot of jurisdictions don't train their mine rescue responders to the level that we do. They didn't have specialists available to maintain the apparatus as we do in Ontario and across most of Canada. Interesting to see. One of the unique things about that technician competition is that we used a standard apparatus which wasn't common to a lot of the jurisdictions. We thought we were being a little unfair. It was a typical Canadian guilt that we had. In the end, the team that actually won the technician competition didn't use the Draeger BG4, had only started training on it 6 months before. So it was a testament to the fairness of the competition and the talent of the competitors. That technician competition was run by Charlie Burton, now retired, the supervisor of mine rescue, and John Hagan, one of our mine rescue officers. The theory exam was conducted at Cambrian College, and another universal for mine rescue volunteers is that they all hate studying for the theory exam. That was their pet peeve. They all complained about it, but everyone had to do it and get through it equally. Mr. Jim Lundrigan and his team from Glencore pulled together a series of manuals and technical details that the teams had to study in advance. And then 3 members answered questions as a group using a computer-based format, including their translator, to try and answer the theory exam. one of the most visually stunning events that we held was the high-angle rope rescue event. I'm glad that we found this location, and for those of you that recognize it, it's the chasm at Dynamic Earth. It's pretty spectacular. Now, the chasm is the access to the underground tour that they hold, but what we learned was that they have access to the top of the face, and that we could set up our rope rescue competition. So the competition was, and it was a surprise to the teams to walk into a building and see a hole below their feet, but the competition was a pretty standard rope exercise where from top access you had to conduct a pick-off of a stranded individual using a selection of equipment and your own techniques. So this was one of the interesting events where we allowed them freedom so long as they complied with some basic measures that were identified in the risk assessment. Elements such as a belay line, a backup line that's common in Ontario, it's not used in Australia. So we had to mandate certain things like that, and the teams were really okay with it. Here you can see the eventual winners of the competition, the KGHM White Eagles from Poland. We did learn from other teams as well. As I mentioned, they were allowed to conduct the operation as they chose. The majority of teams in Ontario, and indeed in the competition, they use a team-based approach where they lower members down. This is the Terramines team doing a rappel technique, a little different. And then again, of course, very different was the Gold Corp team, who surprised some of the judges and went a little Mission Impossible with their inverted pickoff technique. Nothing wrong with it. Again, we were impressed with the efforts of the Gold Corp team to be so prepared on such short notice. The setting also allowed the teams to do a bit of sightseeing in Sudbury. We were worried that with the busy schedule, they wouldn't have time to see some of the sites. Even getting a picture at the Big Nickel, it was one of the highlights for the teams that seems like an afterthought for a Sudbury resident, but they were all just desperate to get that team photo as they showed up for the rope event. Now, we did have some downtime, and a lot of interested participants that weren't competing wanted to try their hand at the rock face. You may notice this outgoing CEO of Workplace Safety North gently tiptoeing towards the edge. She was braver than I thought. For the teams that didn't have an expertise in rope, this is what took place. We had a full suite of technical judges available, and they allowed not only the teams that weren't trained, but interpreters and spectators to do this kind of exercise, learning exercise, where they're trained on the apparatus and the safety measures, and then get that over the edge feeling. Mr. Ken Levoy and the team from out west ran this event. There's Ken giving a big high five to the guys. Nothing but positive things from this event, even though some of the teams weren't skilled in that field. The next event was the underground firefighting event, and we just discovered that the mine plan won't show up on the display here. But for those of you familiar with it, out in Lively, there's a facility formerly owned by MTI that was used to test their equipment. It's a small underground facility, and it was ideal for this type of challenge. So the underground firefighting event was meant to be a miniature challenge of a typical mine rescue competition. The focus was on a short duration task using breathing apparatus where the only hazards were fire related, unlike a normal mine rescue simulation where there are multiple tasks that you must accomplish. So MTI was ideal because of the small nature of the mine. And one of the things we challenged ourselves with here, or maybe I tortured Marcus with here, Marcus Uchtenhagen was the lead for this event, was the idea of using a live fire in the underground setting. So cardinal sin in the world of mining, the goal was to be able to, and you can see it in that photo there, to challenge the teams to attack a live fire rather than a simulated series of lights and visual impairments and smoke. So I'd say they had the toughest challenge getting to that goal, but in the end, they pulled it off. Training like that does not take place in Ontario. We don't do live fire training underground. There are some jurisdictions that do, but I can tell you that the competitors greatly appreciated this. Not only were they not walking around an arena pretending to look for fires, there was real smoke, real heat, real conditions that they had to manage. They were able to demonstrate their techniques and their decision-making underground. Now, we also had a visit from our Minister of Labour, Mr. Kevin Flynn, who attended this site. And for those of you that know Kevin, has a bit of an emergency services background. He's no stranger to this line of work. He took a stroll out from the cozy spectator viewing area where the TVs were and took a walk up to the portal and took a sniff, and I could see him kind of think for a second. He said, "That smells like real smoke." And, in my head, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to tell him about the risk process. We worked with the inspectorate and this and that. And before I could get the words out of my mouth, a familiar voice to a lot of us, Mr. John Chenier, says those 4 famous words, "Don't worry, we're professionals." So I looked for the nearest 6 pieces of wood to touch because I knew at that point something would go wrong, but it didn't go wrong. Marcus and his team had done a fantastic job, and everything went off without a hitch here. On the first aid side, first aid was incorporated into a lot of the tasks, but we pulled out specifically an event that allowed the teams to demonstrate their skills without being distracted by some of the other elements: mine rescue equipment, search and rescue procedures, communication protocol. What we did was Vale generously donated a portion of their property, known as the 175 ore body, and we simulated a surface drilling operation that had experienced an explosion and now had a medical triage to take for the teams to deal with. Teams were taken directly from a previous event where they had just worked for about 2 hours underground and driven to the site on Valley's property. They were given a briefing by the simulation lead judge, Bruce Hall, and Bruce's team there. They were allowed to select their own equipment, again, from a cache of equipment that they could select from depending on their process and their home jurisdiction. And then they were walked to a scene that was the same for everyone. This was an interesting process. Here you can see the team from Australia, the eventual winners of this event. I'd say events like this were a great learning experience for the judges that participated. Mike Parent was on Bruce's team here, and you couldn't believe the amount of discussion and knowledge exchange that was going on at this event. To see the teams demonstrate a basic element of first aid, but then apply their own home jurisdictional techniques, it was nice. That's what you like to see at an international competition. And the teams that were able to complete the task were then able to go and spectate. So there was a spectator area set up at Valley's Copper Cliff Club, and once they had completed the task, they were then able to watch the following teams complete the task. So what took place here was there was a bystander that needed casualty care. There was a worker suspended from a mast, and there was a worker entangled in the front of the drill. Teams had to make choices based on what they deemed to be priorities and work within a time limit that was set out by the judges. They were scored according to their decisions, as they were in all the events. Following that, the team transported one of the casualties, supposedly for emergency medical care, and then they were measured on a different task, and that was cardiopulmonary resuscitation. We borrowed a very expensive dummy from Sudbury that can measure at a digital level the quality of your CPR technique. And what we did is we had every team demonstrate their technique, rotate team members, and be evaluated. So this task ended up being a twofold scoring. Teams had to be competent in both, and they were being measured against a computer. Probably the most challenging event, I shouldn't say most challenging, the longest event certainly was the underground mine rescue simulation. This, for those of you that know about Ontario competitions, would typically mimic what we do in an Ontario district or provincial competition. But again, the intention was to go underground here and to make it as realistic as possible. Again, Vale offered to let us use 114 ore body, an inactive ore body on their property. And we challenged the teams on a number of topics: the typical emergency procedures, incident command, search and rescue. There were elements of ventilation control, first aid. Really, you had to be perfect to get yourself through this scenario. Unlike previous competitions that had a time limit, this had no time limit. It had some timed tasks. It allowed the teams the freedom to complete it as they chose. That was one of the goals, was to stand back and allow the teams to demonstrate what they would do in their home jurisdiction and then score them accordingly. If it's a good idea in Poland, maybe we should think it's a good idea here. The teams themselves spent quite a bit of time traveling around Sudbury. You can see teams driving in on the bus here. Over a 10-day period, we put about, 1,500 hours of transportation in. We had buses constantly running, and that probably doesn't even include the 2 a.m. trips home from the bar. Teams here, when they arrived on site, they were briefed as if there was an emergency. The control group at that mine would have provided them information and allowed the briefing officer or incident commander to direct his team on how to accomplish the tasks. One of the elements that they used here, you can see it in some of the video footage, was a tablet device. So the majority of teams use this electronic tablet device, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. We also used the theatrical smoke that's common in mine rescue training. We worked the teams pretty hard here. So the task was that 114 ore body has 2 ramps essentially, and we created a loop. In order to get what would have been 30 teams through the problem in 3 days, we had to have multiple teams in the circuit at one time. The evaluation was going to be standard, but at any one time there were 4 teams essentially competing in this task, chasing each other's tail through the problem. It made a logistical nightmare for Sean Rideout and Tim Ebbinghaus, who ran this event, but it went off without a hitch again. I couldn't believe on day 1 they weren't behind schedule, there were no delays, they were ahead of some of the other events. It didn't sound like an Ontario competition at all. The teams had to proceed underground in a vehicle. Their travel way was then blocked by a piece of mining equipment in the ramp, and the operator was in distress. The teams had to evacuate the operator back to surface and continue into their assignment, which was to install a ventilation barricade. The interesting thing about the ventilation barricade was that, again, we gave them an assortment of materials, allowed them the choice of what to build, how to build it, and learned about techniques from around the world. The sad part was the teams that chose the cinder blocks, when they could have chose Fabrine, they made a lot of work for themselves, and they made even more work for the teams of volunteers that had to tear those walls down for 3 days. You can see here a little bit of the team from Kirkland Lake Gold in a time lapse of what they would have gone through. The typical emergency preparedness of equipment in a fresh air base. They proceed underground after being briefed and go to those first 2 tasks. The interesting thing about that barricade they had to build was, you'll see it in some of the thermal footage, we cranked up the heat in there with 2 industrial size heaters just to begin to experiment with them. So one of the research projects that I'll touch on in a minute was measuring the physiological effect of mine rescue work. What each of these volunteers was wearing was a vital sign monitoring device under their coveralls. So we began working the volunteers, the mine rescue responders, at the start of the problem with the goal of measuring when they hit walls, when their mental performance deteriorates, and what the heat-related factors are with respect to this work. We now have 27 teams worth of data, slightly less because not all the teams participated, but what it'll allow us to do is to understand commonalities with variables such as age, fitness levels, and fitness standards in the various countries. Now, I said at the start that it's not about winning, but we did give out awards, and we did pick winners and losers. In the end, really, we had winners all around. The interesting thing about about the way the awards rolled out is that the 21 awards were shared between 13 teams. So there was a fair distribution amongst the teams. 5 of the 6 Canadian teams placed in the events. So despite our best efforts to handicap the Canadian teams in the interest of fairness, they did extremely, extremely well. The nice things to see were the teams that were challenged by handicaps of language or standards that performed well in several tasks. One of the problems with previous competitions that you hear back from competitors is, well, it's home court advantage. We don't have a chance of winning. We just hope to be somewhere in the top 10. We wanted to turn that on its head here. Of all the international competitions, there have only ever been 2 where the host nation didn't win their own event. I was pulling for anyone but Canada, but unfortunately Canada was too good. As I said, I handicapped them and they trained their butts off, and Canada ended up pulling out the win. But we did have quite a bit of parity between the teams. The top 9 teams were within 4 percentage points of winning first overall. So there was a good distribution of scoring. There was no gap. There were very few teams that struggled, and their overall scores demonstrated that. Here's a look. I know it's hard to see. Here's a look at who placed in the events. Again, Kirkland Lake Gold was the, I'll say, surprise winner. It was a surprise to them. As we called out awards one by one, you didn't hear much from Kirkland Lake Gold, and I'm sure they were sitting at their table getting awfully depressed. But sometimes that's the way it goes in mine rescue competitions. They were coming 4th and 5th and 6th in all their events, and they didn't know it. And when we called the overall winner, it surprised them. It was nice to see two teams from outside North America do so well, but I can say it wasn't a gimme. The team from Ireland and the team from Poland, the White Eagles, were extremely talented. They impressed the Ontario judges that judged them. That team from Poland, the KGHM White Eagles, you might remember them from the very first picture in 1999. They're the only team that's attended every international competition, and it shows in the training and the mutual understanding that they bring to these events. In the underground scenario, Kirkland Lake Gold was the winner of that. The firefighting event was won by the defending champions from Poland. The Mine Safety and Health Administration from MSHA in the US, that was a unique team essentially comprised of their mine rescue officers. And again, thrown together at the last minute, individuals that hadn't been active responders in years. They did extremely well, and they piqued the interest. I don't see any of our officers here, but our officers have been piqued by that curiosity and that idea. They're looking at the next event in Russia to put a mine rescue officer team together. In first aid, as I mentioned, Australia took home the title. The KGHM White Eagles won the rope rescue event. The theory exam was dominated, I'll say, by some of the Canadian teams who put a lot of effort into studying for that event. And the technician competition, the surprise winner was the Russian military team, again, that doesn't use that apparatus. There was a team from China that placed second, and again, the United States came third. Just to touch a little bit on some of the innovations that we tried to incorporate. I mentioned the tablet device. This is something that our technical advisory committee here in Ontario brought to the Ontario Mine Rescue Program as a research project. They essentially said there's nothing wrong with the captain's clipboard, pencil, and paper, but we should be looking at giving tools to the team that can help them in the future. So we worked with a company out of Newfoundland who you'll hear from tomorrow presenting during the mine rescue topics that developed this mine rescue app, a captain's tablet that the captain could take underground. I was extremely skeptical that this would work and be applied across language barriers, but to their credit, the team from Focus FS and our mine rescue officer, Tim Evinghouse, they personally tracked down every team member in the days leading up to the competition and gave them as much time and training as they needed, and the teams just thrived with the device. They essentially threw their pencil and paper in the garbage and said, this is what we need to use. The device was meant to be extremely simple. It's meant to just replace data logging from pencil and paper, but the eventual functionality of it would be to add third-party applications, connect it to the breathing apparatus, the gas sensors. That's what it can provide in the future, as long as we get the basics down right, and that's what we were exploring at this competition. One of the other small innovations we were looking at from Draeger was the FPS comm attachment for the mine rescue mask. It's a simple little microphone and speaker, but something simple like that greatly improves communications. Now, there are issues related to configuration, but this is something that Ontario is looking at right now and was greatly appreciated by the teams that no longer had to shout through their mask at each other. We use personnel tracking at Valley's 114 ore body, partially to help the team running the event keep track of who's where so that they didn't creep up on each other on that loop, but also to demonstrate to the teams the value of it. Now, a lot of this technology doesn't apply to all mines, to all jurisdictions, we know that, but we wanted to showcase some of these elements to remind the teams that they should be considering them. I mentioned the cross research project. This is a personal favorite of mine. Sandra Dorman and her student, Justin Conrad, have been working on this for a number of years now. We have a requirement to better understand what we do to mine rescue responders when we train them and when we deploy them into an emergency. What you see here was part of that study where you can live track the physiological response of a rescuer as they wear that device. So we allowed spectators to watch as the teams proceeded underground what effect it was having on them. Now, this is just generic sample data, but it was very interesting to see live data come back from how that mine rescue volunteer was feeling. For the volunteers that have been rescuers in this room, you know yourself that there's too much pride involved for you to be honest with how you're feeling. And something like this, it allows us to have an open discussion about the limits of rescue operations, the limits of training, so that we're not doing more harm than good. Just to wrap up, a couple of the elements that we're hoping carry forward in the competition. We are passing the torch off to a new host, and that will be Russia in 2018. But we're hoping that some of the elements that we've incorporated get carried forward. The elements of cross-jurisdictional standards, using rules or allowing rules from other jurisdictions to be applied was critical. Incorporating realistic simulations and challenges for the team, it seems like a no-brainer for us. We're really trying to do that to our teams in Ontario to assess what they would do in reality and not in an arena. So we're hoping that gets carried forward. The international judging concept was a success. Now, it was a pilot project, so it was pretty language dependent. We needed some competency in English, from what jurisdiction they were coming from, but it was a success to see them come and interpret our problems and provide feedback, even up to the last minute after they stepped off the plane. The cross-jurisdictional team from Goldcorp was an innovative idea, and a lot of the teams liked that. And then to see that Goldcorp, which uses a similar corporate standard, was able to effectively deploy a team that had never trained together, it impressed a lot of people. And finally, the transparency element and post-event knowledge sharing. We're hoping to continue that. Russia is hosting the International Mine Rescue Body Conference this year, where we're hoping to share the results of the competition so that these events don't become little castles with trophies. They become open books that you can read about for years, you can learn about, you can prepare for, and the teams can be rewarded for their hard work. So that's just a sprinkling of what we tried to do. I was extremely proud of the team from Workplace Safety North that worked their butts off to get this done, and indeed a lot of the people in this room that contributed as well. So I appreciate you listening, and I hope the rest of the conference goes well for you.